Edward Harrington was a man whose name carried weight in the business world. His life had been filled with meetings, investments, and success. He owned one of the largest trading companies in the city, and his fortune had placed him in a mansion that looked like something from a luxury magazine. But despite all the beauty and wealth around him, the atmosphere in his home was far from peaceful. For years, Edward's first wife had been the quiet heart of the household. She was graceful, kind to the staff, and the house always felt warm under her care. But after she passed away, a kind of emptiness filled the halls. It was 2 years later that Edward remarried. Her name was Claudia, a strikingly beautiful woman in her early 30s, with a taste for elegance and a voice that carried authority wherever she went. At first, Edward thought Claudia's high standards would bring the household to an even, higher level of refinement. But within a few weeks he began to notice something unusual. The staff, who had been loyal for years, began to leave. One by one, the maids quit, some after a week, others in just a few days. It didn't take long for rumors to spread in the neighborhood. People whispered that Claudia was too much to work for, that she was impossible to please. She demanded perfection in every small detail, and if something fell short of her expectations, she didn't hesitate to show her displeasure. The revolving door of maids became almost a pattern. A new maid would be hired, and the staff would quietly make bets on how long she would last. None of them reached the third week. The reasons varied. Sometimes Claudia would criticize how they folded towels. Sometimes it was the way they dusted a shelf, and sometimes it was simply that they didn't anticipate her needs quickly enough. The result was always the same: resignation. Edward, though not blind to the situation, chose not to interfere too much. Claudia was his wife, and he believed she had the right to manage the household the way she wanted. Still, he couldn't ignore the constant shortage of help. Every time a maid left, the hiring process had to begin again, and each time, fewer applicants seemed willing to even try. One sunny afternoon, Edward's assistant posted yet another job advertisement for a live-in maid. It offered generous pay, private accommodation in the mansion, and full benefits. But there was an unusual line at the bottom: must be able to handle a high-pressure environment. It was as much a warning as it was a requirement. In another part of the city, Grace Johnson sat at her kitchen table, reading the advertisement on her phone. Grace was 34, a single mother raising a teenage son. She had been working in housekeeping for over a decade, both in hotels and private homes. She had heard about the Harrington mansion before, and the rumors about Claudia. People in her profession talked, and Claudia's reputation was well known. Grace knew that every maid before her had failed to last. Still, the offer was too good to ignore. The pay alone could cover her rent, her son's school fees, and even allow her to save a little for the future. Grace had a calm personality, and she prided herself on her patience. She told herself, "It's just a job. I don't have to take anything personally." With that mindset, she decided to apply. 2 days later, she received a call from Edward's assistant, inviting her for an interview at the mansion. On the day of the interview, Grace dressed neatly in a simple blouse and skirt, her hair tied back. As she approached the tall iron gates, she took a deep breath. The driveway was lined with manicured hedges, and the white stone mansion stood proudly at the end, its large windows reflecting the morning sun. Edward met her in his study. He was polite, though his eyes carried a hint of tiredness. After asking about her experience, he told her directly, "This job is not easy. My wife has high expectations. Many before you have left quickly." Grace simply smiled and replied, "I understand, sir. I believe every home has its own way of working. I will do my best to fit in." Something in her steady voice made Edward nod. Without further discussion, he offered her the position. Grace's first day began early, just as the sun was rising. She put on her uniform, a crisp white shirt, a navy skirt, and stepped into the grand kitchen, where the chef was already preparing breakfast. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee. The other staff members glanced at her with curiosity, some with pity. One of the housekeepers, an older woman named Maria, leaned close and whispered, "Be careful. She will test you." Moments later, Claudia appeared. She was dressed in a silk robe, her hair perfectly styled, even this early in the morning. She didn't smile. Instead, she gave Grace a long, evaluating look, then began listing tasks in a sharp, clear voice. Polish the silverware. Dust the dining room chandelier. Rearrange the flowers in the hall, and ensure the living room curtains were folded just so at the edges. Grace listened carefully, nodding at each instruction, and got to work immediately. Throughout the day, Grace noticed something. Many of Claudia's demands seemed unnecessary. The flowers were already arranged perfectly, yet she wanted them redone. The curtains barely needed touching, but she wanted them adjusted again. Every hour or so, Claudia would call her for some small change, like reheating tea to a slightly different temperature or moving a chair just a few inches to the left. To many, it might have been frustrating, even insulting. But Grace kept her calm. She did each task without complaint, moving quickly but with care. By lunchtime, she could feel the eyes of the other staff on her. They seemed surprised she was still there. Maria later told her quietly, most would have raised their voice or walked out by now. You were different. Grace only smiled. I'm here to work, that's all. As the day went on, Edward observed from a distance. He saw how Grace responded politely to every call, how she never let irritation show on her face. He had grown used to hearing the sound of doors slamming when maids quit, but today, the house felt strangely steady. He said nothing, choosing, instead, to see how long this calm could last. When evening came, Claudia walked into the dining room where Grace was polishing glasses. She looked around the spotless table, the neatly arranged flowers, the gleaming silverware. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a tone that almost sounded approving, she remarked, not bad. It wasn't much, but for Claudia it was. Rare Grace went to bed that night in her small but comfortable room in the staff quarters. She thought about the day and knew it had been only the beginning. Claudia would test her more in the days to come, that much was certain. But Grace had made a decision before she even stepped into the mansion. She wouldn't be shaken. She was there for her son, for their future, and she believed that patience was her strongest tool. By the end of her first week, Grace was still there, something no one had done in months. The whispers in the staff kitchen began to change. Some were curious, others quietly hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, Grace would be the one to last. Grace's second week at the Harrington mansion began with the sound of the grandfather clock chiming 6 in the morning. She had already been awake for half an hour, going over the day's plan in her head. She knew by now that in Claudia's home, there was no such thing as enough work. If something was clean, it could always be cleaner. If something looked perfect, there was still room for improvement. She walked quietly into the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The chef, Peter, greeted her with a small nod. Another day in the lion's den, he said half-jokingly. Grace smiled faintly and began organizing the breakfast trays. She had learned that Claudia's coffee had to be served at exactly the right temperature. Not too hot, not lukewarm. Claudia could tell the difference instantly. Grace now prepared the cup last, bringing it to her just in time so it would be perfect. At precisely 7:15, Claudia appeared in the dining room, wearing a pale blue silk robe. She glanced at the breakfast table, then at Grace. The flowers are too far to the left, she said, pointing at the vase in the center. Without a word, Grace adjusted it slightly. Claudia's eyes moved to the napkins. These fold them again. The corners are not sharp enough. Most people would have sighed or shown a flicker of annoyance, but Grace simply picked up the napkins and refolded them carefully. She didn't rush, but she didn't take too long either. She placed them back in perfect alignment and stepped back. Claudia said nothing more and began her breakfast. It was during moments like this that Grace noticed how closely the other staff members watched her. Maria, the housekeeper, often peeked in from the hallway, as if expecting to see Grace stumble or snap. But Grace kept moving, her face calm, her hands steady. She understood that Claudia's tests weren't always about the actual work. Sometimes they were about patience. The rest of the morning was filled with small but constant interruptions. Grace would be halfway through polishing a mirror when Claudia's voice would call from another room. She would be arranging towels in the guest bathroom when she'd hear her name again. Grace, come here. Grace, I need this moved. Grace, this isn't the right scent for the candles. Each time, Grace stopped what she was doing and went immediately. She never rolled her eyes, never muttered under her breath. She listened, nodded, and did exactly what was asked. This quiet discipline began to make the other staff curious. During lunch break, Maria sat beside her in the staff dining room. I don't understand you, she said with a hint of admiration. She sends you running all over the place. I would have quit by now. Grace smiled softly. It's not personal. She wants things her way. My job is to give her that. If I let her get under my skin, I lose. I can't afford to lose. By the end of the second week, Claudia began adding more complicated tasks. One morning, she asked Grace to reorganize the entire china cabinet, a job that could easily take hours. She stood nearby, watching closely as Grace handled each delicate plate and cup. Claudia made occasional comments that one should be higher. The gold pattern must face forward. The larger plates go to the right. Grace followed every instruction without complaint. She even added her own touch, placing a small lavender sachet inside to keep the cabinet smelling fresh. When Claudia noticed, she tilted her head slightly, as if surprised, but said nothing. The real challenge came one afternoon, when Claudia hosted her friends for tea. She called Grace to the sitting room just minutes before they arrived. I want the table set with the white lace cloth, the gold-rimmed cups, and the rose centerpiece. But the roses must be fresh, and I don't want any leaves on the stems. Grace glanced at the clock. There were only 15 minutes until the guests arrived. Without wasting a second, she headed to the garden, selected the best roses, trimmed them quickly, and arranged them in a vase. She set the table exactly as instructed, every cup perfectly aligned, the lace cloth smooth and spotless. When Claudia's friends walked in, they gasped in admiration. This is lovely, one of them said. Claudia gave a small, proud smile and took her seat. Grace stood in the corner, ready to serve tea, invisible yet essential. As the weeks went on, Grace began to notice something subtle. Claudia's tone was changing. It was still firm, but less sharp. She no longer hovered as closely when giving instructions, and sometimes she even said thank you, though quietly. Edward, too, noticed the difference. One evening, as he passed through the kitchen, he saw Grace wiping down the counters. You're still here, he said with a smile. That's a good sign. Grace chuckled softly. I'm still here, sir. In truth, it wasn't just about surviving. Grace was learning Claudia's rhythm. She could sense when Claudia was about to give an instruction. She began preparing things in advance. Claudia's favorite tea ready before she asked. Her reading chair positioned exactly as she liked it in the afternoon sunlight. Her evening shawl placed neatly on the armrest before dinner. This anticipation began to have an effect. On more than one occasion, Claudia walked into a room ready to issue a command, only to find it had already been done. The first time this happened, she paused for a moment, glanced at Grace, and simply said, Good. The other staff noticed too. The whispers in the staff kitchen turned into quiet praise. She's different, Peter said one afternoon. She doesn't fight. She doesn't give up. It's like she knows what's coming before it happens. By the end of her first month, Grace had something no other maid had managed in recent memory. Stability. The mansion was running smoothly. Claudia's friends began to recognize her face and greeted her politely when they visited. Though Claudia still tested her from time to time, the tension in her voice was softer. Grace knew this didn't mean she was completely accepted yet. Trust in a house like this was slow to build. But she also knew she had passed the first and hardest stage, proving she wouldn't run at the first sign of difficulty. One evening, as she prepared to retire to her quarters, she overheard Claudia speaking to Edward in the next room. She's competent, Claudia said simply. Better than the others. It wasn't a grand compliment, but to Grace, it was more than enough. She went to bed that night knowing she had taken another quiet step toward doing what everyone else thought was impossible. The mornings at the Harrington mansion had started to feel almost predictable to Grace. She woke before sunrise, checked the schedule, and moved quietly through her routine. The tension that once followed her every step was beginning to ease, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down. In this house, things could change in a moment. One crisp Tuesday morning, Grace was polishing the grand mirror in the front hallway when Claudia entered. She was dressed in a cream-colored blouse and tailored trousers, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Grace," she said, "the coffee table in the lounge needs to be rearranged. The books are in the wrong order." Grace had learned not to take such remarks personally. She went to the lounge immediately and began arranging the books. While doing so, she noticed a tiny chip in one of the decorative trays. Without being told, she replaced it with a flawless one from the storage room. When Claudia returned to check, her eyes fell on the tray. "That's better," she said. Grace realized Claudia had noticed the change, even if she didn't mention it directly. That was the beginning of something new. Grace started paying more attention to the smallest details, not just to meet expectations, but to stay ahead of them. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket, where she wrote down things she observed. Claudia preferred her reading lamp to be turned on at exactly 5:30 p.m. in winter. She liked her favorite chair to be slightly angled toward the window. In the mornings, she preferred the white towels for her own bathroom and the pale blue ones for the guest rooms. Grace didn't just notice, she acted. By the time Claudia was ready to give an instruction, the task was already done. One afternoon, the Harringtons were expecting a last-minute visit from an important business associate. Edward was busy on a phone call, and Claudia was fussing over the guest room. "The pillows are not arranged properly," she said, then stopped mid-sentence when she saw Grace had already fixed them. "Oh," she murmured, almost surprised. The guest arrived to find the mansion perfectly in order. Grace made sure the tea was served on time, the biscuits were arranged neatly, and the atmosphere felt warm without being overly formal. The visit went smoothly, and after the guests left, Edward caught Grace in the hallway. "You made that easier for everyone," he said with a quiet smile. It wasn't only the Harringtons who noticed. The other staff began to look at Grace differently. At lunch breaks, Maria and Peter often asked her for advice on how to handle certain situations. "You seem to know what she wants before she even says it," Maria remarked one day. Grace just smiled and replied, "You listen with your eyes, not just your ears." Still, there were moments when Claudia's sharpness returned. One rainy afternoon, a bouquet of fresh lilies arrived, but they were slightly wilted from the weather. Claudia frowned as she inspected them. "These won't do. Get rid of them." Instead of throwing them away, Grace trimmed the stems, refreshed them in cold water, and arranged them in a smaller vase. She placed them on the side table in Claudia's dressing room. Later that evening, Claudia walked in, saw the vase, and paused. "These are the same flowers, aren't they?" she asked. Grace nodded. Claudia gave the faintest smile. "Not bad, Grace." It wasn't much, but Grace had learned that small acknowledgments meant a lot coming from Claudia. Her ability to remain calm under pressure was tested again when Claudia's sister came to visit for a weekend. The sister had a more relaxed personality, but she was particular about her meals and bedding. Claudia asked Grace to handle all of her sister's needs personally, from preparing her tea exactly as she liked it to arranging fresh fruit in her room every morning. Grace managed it all without a single complaint from the guest. In fact, on the last day, the sister pulled Grace aside. "You're the best help this house has seen in a long time," she said warmly. Grace thanked her, knowing that such praise might eventually reach Claudia. As the weeks went by, Grace became a quiet but steady presence in the household. She no longer needed constant supervision. Claudia still inspected her work, but it was now more out of habit than mistrust. One day, while dusting the bookshelves in Edward's study, Grace overheard a short conversation between the couple. Edward was saying, "She's been good for the house, Claudia. Things run smoother now." Claudia's reply was softer than usual. "She's dependable." That word dependable stuck with Grace. It wasn't just about doing chores. It was about becoming someone they could rely on, in a place where trust was hard-earned. That meant everything. Her relationship with Claudia was still professional, but there were small signs of warmth. Sometimes Claudia would ask about her son Daniel. "How is his school going?" she'd ask casually, as if testing the waters of personal conversation. Grace would answer politely, never sharing too much. But appreciating the interest, Then came a moment that truly showed the shift in their dynamic. One Saturday morning, Claudia was preparing to host a charity luncheon. She had planned the seating arrangement down to the last detail. But just an hour before the guests were due, one of the key attendees called to cancel. This threw the table. Planned into chaos, Claudia was visibly tense, pacing in the dining room. "This ruins the balance," she muttered. Grace stepped forward gently. "If I may, ma'am, I could rearrange the seating so it still feels balanced." Claudia hesitated, then handed her the seating cards. In less than 10 minutes, Grace had created a new arrangement that looked just as elegant as the original. When the guests arrived, no one suspected anything had changed. After the luncheon, Claudia found Grace in the kitchen. "You handled that well?" she said simply. For Claudia, that was as close to a heartfelt thank you as it got. From that day, Claudia began to trust Grace with more than just cleaning. She asked her to prepare guest rooms, oversee deliveries, and sometimes even choose the flower arrangements. It was clear that Grace was no longer just surviving in this household. She was becoming essential to it. In the quiet of her room at night, Grace reflected on how far she had come. When she first arrived, everyone expected her to leave in. Days, now weeks had turned into months, and the thought of quitting never crossed her mind. She knew there would still be challenges ahead. But she also knew she had found her rhythm. Grace had started as just another maid in the Harrington household. But slowly, through patience, attention to detail, and an unshakable calm, she was earning something rare in this house: genuine respect. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring when the turning point arrived. The Harrington mansion was quiet in the late morning, but Grace knew this calm wouldn't last. Claudia had been planning a high-profile dinner party for weeks, an event where some of Edward's most important business partners and their spouses would attend. Everything needed to be perfect, from the food to the lighting to the smallest decoration on the table. By midday, the kitchen was alive with activity. Peter, the chef, was preparing an elaborate 5-course meal. Grace moved between rooms like a steady current, checking the tablecloths for wrinkles, adjusting the silverware so each piece caught the light just right, and making sure every candle stood straight in its holder. Claudia was in her element, overseeing every detail. "The crystal glasses must be spotless," she told Grace as she passed through the dining room. "And the chairs must be pushed in exactly 3 inches from the table." Grace nodded and got to work. By now, she was used to Claudia's precise instructions. What mattered most to Grace was not just following orders, but anticipating what might come next. She knew that during events like this, the smallest oversight could feel like a disaster to Claudia. Then, without warning, everything shifted. Around 4 in the afternoon, Peter came into the dining room looking pale. "Grace," he whispered urgently, "I don't feel well." Within minutes, it was clear he was too sick to continue cooking. The dinner party was scheduled to begin at 6. When Claudia heard the news, her face tightened. "This is a disaster," she said sharply, pacing in the kitchen. "Do you realize who is coming tonight? You can't just serve something simple. Everything is planned." Grace could see the panic rising in Claudia's voice. Edward was still at his office, and the other kitchen assistants looked frozen, unsure what to do. Grace took a quiet breath and stepped forward. "I can do it," she said calmly. "I've worked in kitchens before. If Peter can give me the recipes, I can finish them." Claudia looked at her with disbelief. "You? This isn't making sandwiches? This is a fine dining menu." Grace didn't flinch. "Trust me. Let me try. We still have 2 hours. I can keep it on schedule." Peter, clutching his stomach, managed to explain the steps for the remaining dishes before going upstairs to rest. Grace rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She organized the ingredients, set the oven to the right temperature, and began preparing each course one by one. As she worked, she moved with the same steady rhythm she used for housekeeping. No rushing, no panic. She seared the meat to the perfect brown, checked the vegetables so they stayed crisp, and made sure the sauces were smooth and rich. At the same time, she kept an eye on the clock. Claudia hovered nearby at first, ready to step in if things went wrong. But as she watched, her expression slowly changed. Grace's hands moved confidently, Her posture never slouched, and she handled every task with focus. By the time Edward returned home at 5:45, the kitchen was calm again. The appetizers were plated, the main course was in the oven, and the desserts were chilling. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Everything under control?" Claudia hesitated for a moment before answering. Grace took over the cooking, it seems. Fine. At 6 o'clock sharp, the first guests arrived. Grace served the appetizers with quiet efficiency, making sure glasses were filled and plates were cleared without interrupting conversations. She kept the courses moving smoothly, timing each one so the guests were never left waiting. The food was a success. The main course was tender and flavorful, the vegetables perfectly seasoned, and the dessert looked as if it had come from a professional bakery. Guests complimented the meal openly. "This is exquisite," one of Edward's partners said. "Must give us the chef's name." Claudia gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "Our maid prepared it tonight." The table went silent for a moment before one of the guests said, "Well, she's very talented." Grace stayed in the background, clearing plates and replacing them quietly. She didn't need the spotlight. Her satisfaction came from knowing she had saved the evening when the last guest left. Claudia stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment, looking at the spotless table. She then turned to Grace. "You saved this dinner?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "If it had gone badly, it would have been humiliating." "I won't forget it." For Claudia, those words carried weight. It was the first time she had openly acknowledged Grace's value. It wasn't just about cleaning or serving anymore. Grace had proven she could handle a crisis, make decisions, and deliver results that reflected well on the family. The next morning, Claudia surprised Grace by inviting her into the sitting room for tea. It was unusual. Normally, staff were not asked to sit with her unless it was for instructions. Claudia spoke in a more relaxed tone. "I want to explain something." She began, "I haven't been easy on you. I've had past experiences with staff who took advantage of kindness. I test people because I want to know if they are truly trustworthy." Grace listened quietly, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't interrupt or try to defend herself. When Claudia finished, Grace simply said, "I understand, ma'am. My job is to do my best, no matter the test." Claudia's eyes softened just slightly. "Oh, you've passed mine." From that day, something shifted in their relationship. Claudia's tone when giving instructions became less sharp. Sometimes she even asked for Grace's opinion on certain matters, like flower arrangements or the placement of decorations for upcoming events. Edward also noticed the change. Over dinner that evening, he told Claudia, "I think you've found the right person for the house at last." Claudia didn't argue. She simply nodded. Grace, in her quiet way, had done the impossible. She had not only lasted in a position that broke every maid before her, but she had earned the trust of the woman who had been impossible to please. Still, Grace didn't take it for granted. She knew respect in this house was something you had to maintain every day. But now she felt a little more at home within its grand walls. The weeks after the dinner party passed more calmly than anyone expected. The house ran like a quiet machine. The bells that once rang with sharp urgency now felt like simple signals in a steady rhythm. Grace continued to arrive before sunrise and leave after everything was set for the next morning. She did not count the hours. She counted the small wins: a peaceful breakfast, a tidy hallway, a guest who left smiling, a relieved expression on Claudia's face when a detail matched her exact taste. Trust began to show itself in small ways. One afternoon, Claudia handed Grace a set of keys to a locked storage room that held the most delicate china and the expensive seasonal decor. "You may organize this as you see fit," she said. It sounded ordinary, but the keys felt heavy. In Grace's palm, they were not just metal. They were a sign that her work had changed how this house breathed. With the keys came initiative. Grace redesigned how supplies were ordered, labeled, and stored. She made a simple checklist for the staff that showed who was responsible for each area and when tasks needed to be done. She added a gentle second column. "If something goes wrong, try this first." It was not to blame anyone. It was to help. The list steadied the team. Maria, who had once watched in quiet fear, now smiled during breaks. Peter, once worried he would disappoint Claudia, now joked again while stirring his sauces. The staff began to say we, not I, when speaking about the work. On a quiet Sunday, Edward found Grace in the kitchen reviewing the week's deliveries. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You have changed this home," he said in a calm voice. "It is not just clean, it's peaceful." He slid a small envelope across the counter. "A bonus," he added. "Use it for something that makes your life easier." Grace thanked him, surprised by the warmth in his eyes. That evening, she bought her son Daniel a used laptop so he could do his school assignments without rushing to the library. When Daniel thanked her, she told him it was because the house where she worked was finally gentle enough to let her breathe. Even with the new calm, life still tested the household. A spring storm rolled in one Friday before a small art showing that Claudia had planned in the conservatory. The rain was heavy, and the wind shook the tall trees that lined the driveway. An hour before guests were due to arrive, the power went out. The house went silent in one breath. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Grace moved. She guided the team like a conductor. Peter used the gas stove to keep the appetizers warm. Maria opened all the interior doors to let the natural light come through. "I'll bring the battery lamps from storage and place them along the hall and conservatory walkway." She phoned the generator company and then phoned 2 neighbors who had offered help during emergencies. She lit unscented candles in steady rows where the light was lowest and kept them far from any fabric. She placed a tall glass bowl of white river stones on the main table so the candlelight would reflect and look brighter without being flashy. When the guests arrived, the storm was still loud, but the house glowed softly. People laughed in gentle surprise. "How charming," one guest said. "It feels like an old-world evening." Grace moved quietly among them, making sure paths were clear, surfaces were dry, and the trays never ran empty. The generator switched on halfway through the event, but by then, the room already felt warm and intentional. After the last guest left, Claudia stood in the conservatory doorway with her hands folded. "I did not plan this," she said, glancing at the soft lights that still flickered, "but it turned out beautiful." She looked at Grace. "You turned a problem into a style." The change in Claudia continued. She no longer spoke only in commands. Sometimes she asked, "What do you think?" When a new shipment of linens arrived, she waited for Grace's opinion before choosing which set to keep for the guest rooms. When planning a weekend visit from Edward's cousin, she said, "You know her better now. Would you set up the room the way she likes?" The question felt simple, but it carried something deeper: permission and respect. Grace did not brag. She kept doing the work, one careful action at a time. She trained a new junior maid with patience and kindness, explaining that success in this house meant noticing the quiet things. "If you see her pick up a book every afternoon," Grace said, "make sure the lamp is ready before that time. If you see she starts wearing a shawl after sunset, have it folded across the chair. Service is often done in advance, not in response." The junior maid wrote it down and nodded, grateful. When summer approached, Edward and Claudia planned a 2-week trip abroad. Would be their longest time away since they married. At first, Claudia hesitated to confirm the tickets. She walked through each room as if trying to decide whether the house would stay whole without her. Then, one afternoon, she called Grace to the sitting room. "While we are away," Claudia said, "I want you to manage the house, handle deliveries, oversee maintenance, and make sure the schedule continues. I will check in, but I expect to worry very little. Can you do that?" Grace held her gaze and gave a small, confident nod. "Yes, ma'am. It will be looked after." The day they left, the house felt large and quiet, but not empty. It felt sturdy, like a well-built ship whose crew knew the water. Days a few challenges appeared. Small leaks showed up under the kitchen sink. Grace called the plumber and rescheduled a produce delivery so the kitchen prep could continue without mess. A package meant for a neighbor arrived by mistake. She made sure it got to the right door with a polite note attached. On the fifth day, a reporter called to confirm a rumor about an event at the mansion. Grace kept her voice steady and professional. "There is no public event. You may contact Mr. Harrington's office for statements," she said. Then alerted Edward's assistant and documented the call. Throughout the 2 weeks, staff looked to Grace for direction. She listened to them. She did not rush decisions. When Maria worried about reupholstering 2 dining chairs that had small tiers, Grace asked, "Which guests are coming next? Will it matter more to fix them now or after?" They decided to rotate the chairs toward the ends of the table for a small private lunch and schedule the repair the following week. Problems became projects. Projects became tasks with dates. The house flowed. Claudia phoned 3 times. First call was short and businesslike. "How are things?" she asked. Grace answered clearly, with simple facts and a calm tone. The second call was gentler. "Did the gardener handle the hedges?" Claudia asked. Grace assured her they had, and she described a small adjustment she made to the flower beds so the walkway looked more balanced. Claudia listened and said, "Good." The third call came near the end of the trip. "I'm not worrying," Claudia said, almost as if the words surprised her. "Thank you." Grace smiled after she hung up. It was the kind of thank you that echoed softly, the way a kind word does when a room has been too quiet for too long. When the Harringtons returned, the house looked exactly as they liked it, and yet somehow kinder. Fresh flowers stood in calm arrangements. The kitchen was stocked. The staff moved with easy confidence. Edward placed his suitcase down and said, "It feels better than when we left." Claudia walked through each room, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a frame, a corner of a folded napkin. At last, she raised her eyes to Grace. "Well managed," she said. Then, after a small pause, she added, "Thank you, Grace." The words were plain, but they were full. A few days later, Edward asked Grace to meet him in his study. He offered her a seat, which he rarely did with staff. "We would like to make your role official," he said, "house manager. Your pay will increase, and you will oversee schedules, vendors, and training. You have already been doing the work. It just recognizes it." Grace sat very still for a moment, then nodded with quiet gratitude. "I will make sure the house keeps its peace," she said. "News travels fast in a city, especially among workers, whose lives weave in and out of the same neighborhoods and gates." Soon people heard not only that a maid had lasted under the new wife, but that she had been promoted. Some said it was luck. Others said it was timing. Those who had seen her work knew the truth. It was patience, respect, and steady hands. Grace did not forget why she started. On her first day off after the promotion, she took Daniel to the small cafe near their apartment. They shared a sandwich and laughed about his school project. He told her he wanted to study architecture. "You build good spaces," he said, smiling. "I want to build them too." Grace looked at him and felt a soft pride. She had built a space inside another person's home, a space where people could breathe, think, and feel safe. Maybe that was a kind of architecture too. The next time Claudia hosted a gathering, she introduced Grace to a couple of guests who admired the smoothness of the evening. "She is the one who keeps this house together," Claudia said simply. Grace nodded politely and returned to her work. She did not need applause. The sound she lived for was simpler, the even heartbeat of a home that was no longer afraid of its own reflection. Late one evening, after the rooms were quiet and the lamps were dim, Grace stood in the hallway and listened to the house. It was the same mansion with the same grand staircase and high windows, but it felt different now. It felt kind. She thought about the first day, the tests, the D,